In the heart of spring, amidst the bloom and bluster, there lies a day unlike any other. A day where the world turns topsy-turvy, where the unexpected is expected, and where the serious cloak of reality is momentarily lifted. Welcome to April Fool's Day, a celebration of whimsy and the art of delightful deception. The essence of April Fool's Day is a gentle reminder not to clutch the reins of life too tightly. For in the grand tapestry of existence, we are but fleeting figures, dancing in the light, shadows, and sometimes the rain. It prods us with a playful finger, and to remember we're not going to make it out alive anyway. So, why not embrace the journey with laughter in our hearts? As you navigate the quirks and quandaries of this day, let yourself be carried away by its spirit. Let the unpredictable weather of spring as be a metaphor for life itself, ever-changing, surprising, and utterly beautiful in its complexity. Tracing its roots back, through the annals of time, April Fool's Day dances on the edges of history and myth. Some whisper it began with the vernal equinox, a time of rebirth and reawakening, when Mother Nature herself plays the trickster, casting the weather in unpredictable roles. Sunshine one moment showers the next, the ultimate Jester. One of the earliest associations of a festival resembling April Fool's Day comes from ancient Roman times with the festival of Hilaria, celebrated at the vernal equinox on March 25th. Dedicated to Cybele, the mother of the gods, Hilaria marked a day of rejoicing after the solemn observances of the preceding days. Participants disguised themselves in costumes and mocked each other in jest. It was a time of games, processions, and masquerades where social roles were often inverted, and the usual Roman sobriety was set aside in favor of laughter and jest. The festival's name itself, Hilaria, suggests merriment and joy, embodying the essence of what would much later become known as April Fool's Day. The Roman Hilaria might be considered a distant predecessor, illustrating the age-old tradition of dedicating specific days to unbridled joy and the upending of daily seriousness. In medieval Europe, the Feast of Fools was celebrated, although on different dates across different parts of Europe. This festival involved a reversal of roles, where the lower clergy would assume higher offices' duties in a mock fashion, often leading to humorous and absurd situations. This inversion of the social order and the general atmosphere of merriment and jest could have been a precursor to modern April Fool's Day traditions. A more direct lineage of April Fool's Day may be traced back to the adoption of the Gregorian calendar. In 1582, Pope Gregory VIII issued a papal bull decreeing the transition from the Julian calendar, which celebrated New Year's Day around the end of March, to the Gregorian calendar, which moved the new year to January 31st. Across the globe, different cultures have their own variations and names for April Fool's Day, but the essence remains the same: a day dedicated to playful deception and humour. In Scotland, for example, April Fool's Day is celebrated over 2 days. The second day is called Taily Day, dedicated to pranks involving the buttocks. Taily Day's gift to posterity is the kick me sign. Despite its uncertain origins, April Fool's Day has been celebrated for centuries. In the modern era, It has been embraced by media outlets, corporations and individuals alike, leading to elaborate pranks that sometimes fool not just individuals but large segments of the population. Thus, April Fool's Day illustrates the human love for humour and playfulness, cutting across cultures and historical periods. It reminds us of the value of laughter and not taking life too seriously, albeit for just one day. On this April Fool's Day, as you tread the fine line between fantasy and reality, remember to pause, smile, and perhaps play a prank or two. After all, in the grand scheme of the universe, a day dedicated to laughter and lightheartedness is not just a joke, it's a profound reminder of the joy of living. Happy April Fool's Day, everyone, or Happy New Year to those fools who still celebrate.